Previous relationships, timeline overlaps, and lifestyle shifts have added fuel to the fire, even though much of it remains based on claims, speculation, or interpretations rather than fully confirmed facts. That's what makes this situation messy. There are pieces of truth mixed with strong opinions, and the line between the two keeps getting blurred. Supporters of Katt see him exposing patterns that people ignored, while others believe he's amplifying narratives for impact and entertainment. Meanwhile, Steve Harvey's responses, both past and present, continue to be analyzed for what they reveal beneath the surface, especially when his reactions seem stronger than expected for someone dismissing the claims. All of this creates a cycle where every new comment, interview, or clip adds another layer instead of resolving anything. In the end, the conversation has moved far beyond simple celebrity drama and turned into a debate about perception versus reality, about how much of what the public sees is carefully constructed and how much is genuine. And that's exactly why people keep watching, because the more this story unfolds, the harder it becomes to tell where facts end and narrative begins. As the conversation keeps evolving, what makes this situation even more compelling is how it highlights the fragile nature of public image in the entertainment world. When someone like Steve Harvey builds a brand centered around wisdom, success, and authority, any challenge to that image, especially one coming from a figure like Katt Williams, is bound to attract attention. Katt's approach doesn't rely on soft criticism. Instead, he leans into bold, direct statements that force people to question what they thought they knew. By bringing Marjorie Harvey into the conversation, he shifts the focus from professional rivalry to personal dynamics, which naturally makes the story feel more intense and layered. At the same time, the public reaction shows how quickly narratives can form online. Once certain claims start circulating, they get repeated, expanded, and sometimes exaggerated, turning speculation into something that feels like established truth. That doesn't necessarily mean the claims are accurate, but it does show how powerful perception can be in shaping reality. Another key element here is timing. The fact that these topics are resurfacing years after the original tension suggests that unresolved issues may still exist, or at the very least, that they continue to generate attention whenever they are brought back into the spotlight. Observers are also noticing how different versions of the story coexist at the same time. On one side, there's the polished, successful image of a blended family and a stable career, and on the other, there are allegations, rumors, and alternative narratives that challenge that image. This contrast is what keeps people engaged, because it creates uncertainty and invites interpretation. Some viewers see Katt as exposing inconsistencies, while others see him as crafting a narrative designed to provoke reactions. Meanwhile, Steve's continued responses, even when framed as dismissive, keep the situation alive rather than shutting it down. Ultimately, what's unfolding here is less about proving one side right or wrong and more about how stories are told, repeated, and believed in the modern media landscape. The longer it continues, the more it becomes a case study in how celebrity reputations are built, challenged, and reshaped in real time, with every new detail adding to a narrative that still feels far from finished. What pushes this situation even further is how it reflects a larger pattern within celebrity culture, where personal history, relationships, and public branding all collide in ways that are impossible to separate. When Katt Williams keeps revisiting these points, it doesn't just feel like random commentary, it feels intentional, like he's trying to reframe how people view success stories that once seemed straightforward. By repeatedly bringing attention to Marjorie Harvey and her influence, he's essentially questioning whether the version of events the public has accepted is complete or carefully curated. At the same time, the response from Steve Harvey, whether defensive, dismissive, or emotional, adds another layer of intrigue, because it suggests that these conversations are hitting closer to home than he might want to admit publicly. The audience, meanwhile, is left trying to piece everything together, comparing timelines, past interviews, and resurfaced clips to see what aligns and what doesn't. This kind of scrutiny is amplified by social media, where even small details can quickly become major talking points, especially when they appear to contradict a long-standing narrative. Another factor keeping the story alive is the idea of control. Who controls the narrative? Who shapes the public image? And how much of that image is authentic versus strategic? In Katt's version, control seems to sit behind the scenes, influencing decisions and guiding outcomes, while in the public-facing version, everything appears organic and self-made. That contrast creates tension, and tension is what keeps people engaged. It also raises broader questions about how much audiences really know about the lives of public figures, and whether the stories presented to them are ever fully transparent. As more discussions unfold, the focus is no longer just on specific claims or incidents, but on the bigger picture: how narratives are constructed, how power operates within relationships, and how easily perception can shift when new information enters the conversation. In the end, the reason this situation continues to gain attention is not just because of the individuals involved, but because it taps into something larger: the ongoing curiosity about what happens behind the scenes in a world where image often matters just as much as reality, if not more. As the story keeps unfolding, it becomes clearer that the real fuel behind all this attention isn't just the names involved, but the unanswered questions that continue to linger. When Katt Williams raises these points, he isn't presenting a neat conclusion, he's opening doors that lead to even more speculation, and that's exactly what keeps people engaged. The more he talks about influence, timing, and behind-the-scenes dynamics, the more audiences start re-examining everything they thought they understood about Steve Harvey and Marjorie Harvey. It creates a situation where even ordinary details, past interviews, relationship timelines, or public appearances, are suddenly viewed through a different lens. What once seemed like simple success stories now feel more complex, layered with possibilities that weren't previously considered. At the same time, it's important to recognize how easily narratives can evolve once they gain traction online. Repetition alone can make an idea feel credible, even when it's built on partial information or interpretation. That doesn't automatically disprove the claims, but it does mean the conversation exists in a space where facts and assumptions are constantly blending together. Another reason this situation keeps growing is because neither side is fully closing the door. Katt continues to speak in a way that invites interpretation, while Steve's responses, even when indirect, keep the tension alive instead of resolving it. Meanwhile, Marjorie's role remains one of the most debated aspects, not because of confirmed evidence, but because of how central she is to the narrative being constructed. This creates a loop where every new mention reinforces the story, making it harder for the discussion to fade away. In a broader sense, this entire situation highlights how modern audiences engage with celebrity culture, not passively, but actively, questioning, comparing, and forming their own conclusions based on fragments of information. And as long as those fragments keep appearing, whether through interviews, clips, or commentary, the story will continue to evolve, not necessarily toward a clear answer, but toward an ever-expanding narrative that keeps people watching, debating, and trying to figure out what really lies beneath the surface. At this stage, the entire situation has moved beyond a simple back and forth and turned into something that reflects how power, image, and storytelling operate in the public eye. When Katt Williams keeps pressing these ideas, he's not just challenging Steve Harvey directly, he's challenging the structure around him, the carefully built reputation, and the narrative that has been accepted for years without much resistance. By placing Marjorie Harvey at the center of that discussion, the focus shifts toward influence and decision-making, raising the question of how much of a public figure's life is self-directed versus shaped by those closest to them. This is where the conversation becomes more layered, because it's no longer about proving specific claims, but about understanding patterns in timing, responses, and how certain parts of the story are emphasized while others remain in the background. For audiences, this creates a sense of curiosity that's hard to ignore, especially when different pieces seem to connect in ways that weren't obvious before. At the same time, the lack of clear confirmation or denial keeps everything in a gray area, where interpretation plays a huge role. Some people see Katt's commentary as a form of truth-telling, pointing out inconsistencies that deserve attention, while others view it as a strategic narrative designed to provoke reactions and maintain relevance. Meanwhile, Steve's continued presence in the conversation, whether through direct comments or indirect references, ensures that the tension never fully settles. This ongoing dynamic highlights something important about modern media. Stories don't need definitive answers to stay alive. They just need enough uncertainty to keep people talking. And that's exactly what's happening here. Every new mention, every resurfaced clip, and every interpretation adds another layer, making the overall narrative more complex rather than more clear. In the end, what keeps this situation moving isn't just the personalities involved, but the broader questions it raises about authenticity, control, and how easily perception can be shaped when only parts of the full story are visible. As everything continues to unfold, what really stands out is how this situation has turned into a long-running narrative rather than a one-time controversy. And that's largely because it keeps feeding into deeper questions that never seem to get fully answered. When Katt Williams speaks on it, he doesn't just revisit old points. He reframes them in a way that makes people reconsider the entire timeline, almost like he's inviting the audience to connect dots for themselves. That approach keeps the discussion alive because it doesn't close anything off. Instead, it expands the conversation further. On the other side, Steve Harvey continues to address the situation in a way that feels reactive rather than final, which adds to the sense that there's still something unresolved beneath the surface. And then there's Marjorie Harvey, whose role in all of this remains one of the most talked about elements, not necessarily because of confirmed details, but because of how central she has become to the narrative being discussed. The combination of these three perspectives creates a kind of tension that doesn't easily fade, especially in an environment where every statement can be replayed, analyzed, and interpreted in multiple ways. Another important aspect is how audiences themselves are shaping the story. People are no longer just consuming information, they are actively debating it, forming theories, and amplifying certain angles over others. This means the narrative isn't controlled by any one person, it's constantly evolving based on how it's being discussed and shared. At the same time, the lack of clear, definitive evidence keeps everything in a space where belief often depends on perspective rather than proof. Some viewers are convinced there's a deeper truth being hinted at, while others see it as a mix of entertainment, exaggeration, and selective storytelling. What's undeniable, though, is that the longer this continues, the more it becomes less about individual claims and more about the broader idea of how public figures maintain their image in a world where every detail, past or present, can resurface at any moment. And until something definitive brings closure, this story will likely keep evolving, driven by curiosity, speculation, and the constant push to uncover what people feel is still being left unsaid. At this point, the situation feels less like a disagreement between individuals and more like an ongoing narrative that keeps reinventing itself every time new commentary surfaces. What keeps it alive is not just what Katt Williams says, but how those statements interact with the public image that Steve Harvey has built over decades. When that image is challenged, especially in a way that questions authenticity or control, it naturally draws more attention than ordinary celebrity drama. Bringing Marjorie Harvey into the discussion adds another layer, because it shifts the focus toward influence within personal relationships, and how that influence might extend into professional decisions or public responses. Whether those claims are accurate or not, the idea itself is enough to spark debate, and once that debate begins, it tends to grow on its own. Another key reason this story continues to expand is because of how modern audiences engage with content. They don't just accept information at face value anymore. They revisit past clips, compare timelines, and look for patterns that might support or contradict what's being said. This kind of active participation turns a single narrative into multiple parallel interpretations, each with its own following. At the same time, the absence of clear confirmation or resolution keeps everything open-ended, allowing speculation to fill the gaps. That uncertainty is powerful, because it gives people room to project their own conclusions onto the situation, making it feel more personal and engaging. Meanwhile, Every time Steve responds, even indirectly, it adds fuel rather than closure, reinforcing the idea that the conversation is far from over. In a broader sense, this entire situation highlights how reputation, perception, and storytelling are deeply connected in the public sphere. A single claim can ripple outward, intersect with existing narratives, and create a much larger conversation than originally intended. And as long as those ripples keep spreading, through interviews, reactions, and ongoing discussions, the story will continue to evolve, not necessarily toward a final answer, but toward an ever-expanding web of perspectives that keeps people watching, questioning, and trying to understand what lies beneath the surface of what they are being shown. As the narrative keeps stretching forward, it's becoming clear that the real momentum behind this story isn't just the claims themselves, but the way they keep intersecting with perception, timing, and audience reaction. Every time Katt Williams revisits the topic, he doesn't just repeat the same points. He reinforces a pattern that encourages people to question consistency, especially in how Steve Harvey presents his journey versus how others describe it. That contrast alone keeps the discussion alive, because it creates a gap between two versions of reality, the polished public narrative and the alternative perspective being pushed. When Marjorie Harvey is placed at the center of that gap, it adds a strategic dimension to the conversation, turning it from personal disagreement into a broader discussion about influence and control. Whether people agree with that framing or not, it introduces a level of complexity that goes beyond simple entertainment gossip. At the same time, the audience plays a major role in sustaining the story. Every reaction, every theory, and every shared clip adds another layer, making the narrative feel larger and more significant than any single statement. What's interesting is how quickly perceptions can shift. Something that might have been dismissed before can suddenly gain traction if it aligns with a growing pattern people think they see. This is where the story becomes less about proving facts and more about interpreting signals, reading between the lines, and deciding which version feels more believable. Meanwhile, the lack of a definitive resolution keeps everything in motion, because unanswered questions tend to carry more weight than clear answers in the digital space. Even silence can be interpreted as a response, adding to the overall tension. In the bigger picture, this situation highlights how modern narratives are rarely linear. They expand, overlap, and evolve based on how they are discussed rather than how they begin. And as long as there's room for interpretation, disagreement, and curiosity, the story will continue to move forward, driven not just by the people involved, but by the audience trying to make sense of it all. At this point, the story has taken on a life of its own, evolving into something that is less about any single claim and more about the ongoing tension between perception and reality. What Katt Williams has done, intentionally or not, is create a narrative framework where every action, past or present, connected to Steve Harvey and Marjorie Harvey can be reinterpreted through a different lens. That framework doesn't require definitive proof to function. It thrives on patterns, timing, and the suggestion that there is more beneath the surface than what is openly shown. This is why even small details, an old interview, a resurfaced clip, or a subtle response, can suddenly carry more weight than they originally did. The audience begins to connect those details, building their own version of the story piece by piece. At the same time, the lack of a clear endpoint keeps everything in motion, because there's always another angle to explore, or another interpretation to consider. What makes this especially powerful is how it taps into a broader curiosity about how public figures construct their identities, how much of what we see is genuine, and how much is carefully shaped over time. In this context, Katt's commentary functions less like a direct accusation and more like a catalyst, pushing people to question narratives they might have previously accepted without hesitation. Meanwhile, Steve's continued engagement with the topic, even when framed as dismissal, prevents the situation from fading into the background, reinforcing the idea that something unresolved still lingers. Marjorie's role remains a focal point, not because of confirmed conclusions, but because her presence adds depth to the discussion about influence and decision-making within high-profile relationships. Ultimately, The reason this narrative continues to grow is because it operates in a space where certainty is limited but curiosity is constant. As long as there are unanswered questions, contrasting perspectives, and new pieces of information entering the conversation, the story will keep expanding, less like a straight line, and more like a network of ideas that people continue to explore, debate, and reinterpret over time. As this narrative keeps unfolding, it's becoming more about how stories are sustained rather than how they begin. What Katt Williams has effectively done is introduce a lens that people now keep using to interpret everything related to Steve Harvey and Marjorie Harvey. Once that lens is in place, every new detail, no matter how small, gets filtered through it, which keeps reinforcing the same questions instead of resolving them. That's why even moments that might seem unrelated on the surface start feeling connected when viewed in this context. It creates a continuous loop where perception drives interest, and interest keeps the narrative alive. At the same time, the balance between confirmed information and speculation remains unclear, which is exactly what allows the conversation to keep growing. People are not just reacting to what is known, they are reacting to what they think might be possible based on patterns they believe they see. This dynamic turns the audience into active participants in shaping the story, rather than passive observers. Meanwhile, the responses coming from Steve, whether direct or indirect, continue to add energy to the situation, because any reaction can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on perspective. Marjorie's presence in the narrative adds another layer of complexity, as discussions around influence and decision-making naturally invite more curiosity, especially when they involve high-profile relationships. The longer this continues, the less it becomes about specific events and the more it reflects a broader phenomenon: how modern media environments allow narratives to evolve without needing clear conclusions. Instead of moving toward closure, the story expands outward, absorbing new interpretations and perspectives along the way. In that sense, what we are seeing isn't just a conflict, it's an ongoing example of how public narratives are built, challenged, and reshaped in real time, driven as much by audience engagement as by the people at the center of it. At this stage, the narrative has fully transitioned into something that feeds on momentum rather than resolution, where every new mention simply extends the life of the story instead of bringing it to a close. What Katt Williams has set in motion is a perspective that keeps encouraging people to look beneath the surface, to question not just specific events, but the entire structure of how Steve Harvey has presented his life and career over time. Once that kind of questioning begins, it rarely stops, because each answer tends to create more questions rather than fewer. The involvement of Marjorie Harvey adds a layer that shifts the focus from individual actions to shared dynamics, making the conversation feel more complex, and in some ways, more personal. This complexity is exactly what keeps people engaged, because it allows for multiple interpretations to exist at the same time, without any single one being definitively proven or disproven. In today's media environment, that kind of ambiguity is powerful. It keeps discussions active, encourages deeper analysis, and gives audiences the sense of participation in uncovering what they believe to be the truth. At the same time, the continuous back and forth, whether direct or indirect, prevents the narrative from fading, as each reaction becomes another piece of the puzzle that people try to fit together. What's particularly notable is how the story has grown beyond its original context, turning into a broader reflection on how public figures manage their image, how influence operates within close relationships, and how easily perception can shift when alternative viewpoints are introduced. The longer this continues, the more it highlights the idea that in the world of public attention, clarity is not always the driving force, curiosity is. And as long as curiosity remains, fueled by unanswered questions and evolving interpretations, the narrative will keep expanding, drawing in more attention, and keeping people invested in trying to understand what might be happening beyond what is openly visible. At this stage, the narrative has become almost self-sustaining, evolving beyond any single statement or moment and turning into an ongoing cycle of interpretation and reaction. Katt Williams has effectively planted a perspective that keeps encouraging people to question the consistency of Steve Harvey's public image. And once that kind of questioning begins, it tends to expand rather than settle. Every detail, past interviews, public appearances, even subtle shifts in tone, starts to feel like part of a larger puzzle that audiences are trying to piece together. The continued inclusion of Marjorie Harvey in this conversation adds depth, because it introduces the idea that influence might operate behind the scenes in ways that aren't immediately visible, making the story feel more layered and complex. What's driving this forward is not just the claims themselves, but the way they invite interpretation. People are constantly comparing different versions of events, looking for patterns, and deciding for themselves what seems most believable. In this environment, the absence of a clear resolution actually works in the story's favor, because it leaves space for ongoing discussion and evolving perspectives. Each time the topic resurfaces, it doesn't reset, it builds on everything that came before, making the narrative richer, but also more complicated. Meanwhile, any response from Steve, whether intended to address the situation or dismiss it, becomes another piece of the narrative rather than a conclusion, reinforcing the idea that the story is still open. Over time, this has shifted the focus away from individual claims and toward broader themes about how public figures manage perception, how influence is understood within relationships, and how easily narratives can be reshaped when new interpretations emerge. Ultimately, what keeps this story alive is not certainty, but curiosity, the constant pull to understand what might be happening beneath the surface, even when the full picture remains just out of reach. As the narrative finally moves toward a closing point, what stands out the most is not a clear answer, but the lasting impact of the questions that have been raised. Katt Williams has shifted the conversation in a way that makes people look beyond surface-level success and start thinking about how narratives are built, protected, and sometimes challenged. At the same time, Steve Harvey continues to represent a carefully constructed public image that has remained strong for years, even as alternative perspectives try to reshape how that image is viewed. The inclusion of Marjorie Harvey in this discussion adds a final layer, bringing attention to the idea that influence, relationships, and perception are often more connected than they appear on the surface. But the reality is, much of what's being discussed exists in a space where interpretation plays a bigger role than confirmed fact. And that's exactly why the conversation doesn't come to a clean, definitive end. Instead, it leaves room for the audience to decide what they believe, based on how they interpret the information presented to them. This is what defines modern storytelling in the public eye. Stories don't always conclude with certainty, they evolve, leaving behind questions that continue to shape perception long after the discussion fades. In the end, this situation becomes less about proving one narrative over another, and more about understanding how easily perspectives can shift when new angles are introduced. And that final thought is what lingers, because once people start questioning what they see, they rarely go back to viewing it the same way again. And that's exactly where this story leaves everyone, right at the edge of certainty, but never fully stepping into it. What started as commentary from Katt Williams has grown into a conversation that challenges how people view success, influence, and the narratives surrounding Steve Harvey and Marjorie Harvey. The facts, the claims, the reactions, they all exist side by side, but they don't always align in a way that gives a clear answer. Instead, they create a space where interpretation takes over, and that's where the audience becomes part of the story. Some will see this as a case of truths being hinted at but never fully revealed, while others will see it as a narrative shaped by perspective and amplified for impact. Either way, the discussion itself becomes the main focus, because it reflects something bigger than just one situation. It shows how quickly perception can change when new angles are introduced. And once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to undo. So the real question isn't just about who is right or wrong, it's about what you believe after hearing all sides. Because in a world where image and reality often overlap, the truth isn't always handed to you directly. Sometimes, it's something you have to piece together on your own. Now it's your turn. What's your take on everything that's been said? It's getting real messy inside the Braxton family,